went back to Guatemala every couple of years, actually. And they had a house way up in the mountains overlooking this lake and the volcano, and really just an incredibly beautiful place. So it looks like we are live on YouTube. And let me go over here one moment while we do some things over here. And welcome to everyone who's some more people are coming in. We have Linda, Luis, Hubert, Nelda, Rachel. Hey, Rachel. Trisha, Sharon, Vicky, Deidre. Someone just came in. Helen. A bunch of people. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming. Tonight, we are going to be talking about the microbiome. And if you don't know who I am, my name is Dr. Carp, and essentially my goal in life really is to educate you to become your own authority in health. This is my overriding mission, and by the end of tonight's episode, there's no question that you'll know more about the microbiome than your physician. But really what it comes down to is learning the most practical things so that you can take control of your health and implement these suggestions so that you are as healthy as possible and that you can contribute to your family and in the best way possible. I mean, that's really what it's all about. And I think it's your birthright to be able to learn and do things for yourself, to understand things for yourself, to become, as I always say, your own authority on these matters. Because it's easy to learn. And as I said, by the end of tonight's episode, you are going to know really everything that you need to know to be able to cultivate a healthy microbiome. Now, I've spoken about the microbiome before in week 6. And in week 6, as many of you know, I'm in the process of writing a book. And one of the chapters of this book, which is basically about the 12 rules of health, one is to eat for your microbiome. And I essentially transcribed that episode, and I realized that there were a lot of things that I left out. And of course, there are things that I've learned since that. That was in week 6, episode 6. So I've been able to think about how to present this in the most concise fashion with the most practical tips, as well as sort of give you a little bit of insight into what's actually happening with the microbiome and microbiome science, so that it just, further gets you interested in just learning a little bit more about the science and how you can implement even things that are not necessarily, haven't gotten out to the general public through doctors, how to utilize some of this information to improve your health, and obviously the health of those who you love, which is really, again, what it's all about. So I see we have a couple other people came in. Hey, Grant, who else came in? Hey, Sheila. Very pleased that you're all here. As many of you know, this is one of the highlights of my week, and I get really, a lot of people don't know that you can reach me on my Facebook page. That's probably the easiest way, at Dr. J. Carp, and I answer messages there, and I get some really great comments from people and questions. And as always, this is an open forum, so to speak. So anything that you don't understand, ask a question. As you know, there are no stupid questions. And I'm reminded of, there's this language teacher who is a really amazing guy. His name is Michelle Thomas. And he was a very innovative language teacher, and very famous for a BBC documentary where he taught British teenagers how to speak French in like 2 weeks. And they filmed a documentary with him. And one of the things he said was that the student should always just relax, and that it is the teacher's job, and any kind of misunderstanding in the student is the teacher's responsibility. So I would like to say, in that vein, to basically just relax. Of course, I'm sure you already are, you're home, and many of you have been on most of my classes. So we'll go through it. Okay, and let me blow it up here. So as many of you know, I like to use what's called a mind map. And this allows us to really look at things from categories, because in the world of what they call edutainment, where they're trying to educate you by teaching you, a lot of times they don't provide a framework. They just, in the need for continuing to come out with all kinds of new content, they just throw out all these different facts. And when you have these facts, if you can't figure out how to put them together, then it just causes confusion. So a mind map is really great because it allows you to look at things and to, if you have new facts that come on board, you have a general idea and a framework of where to actually put that information so that it contributes to a further understanding, not just sort of a mishmash of all kinds of different facts. So tonight, we're basically going to be breaking things down in several different categories. And in week 6, we did it a little bit differently. And I think that I've been able to include everything that I'd like to teach you. And honestly, there's not much more from a practical perspective about how to cultivate a healthy microbiome. Now, we've spoken almost every week, the microbiome comes up because we've learned that the microbiome is essentially like an organ of your body in the sense that it is as important as having an organ. In other words, obviously a liver and a heart are very, very important. And with the microbiome, you could almost make the case that it affects all the other organs in so many different ways. And we'll go into that as we progress here tonight. But essentially, here are some cool facts about the microbiome. So there's more microbial DNA than human DNA. So you're essentially a composite organism made up of human cells and microbial, viral, fungal cells as well, which means that you are essentially a microbiome, your microbiome, and the interaction between you and the microbiome is almost like that there is an ecosystem, because you have all these bacterial species and viral species and fungal species mixing together with your human cells, and the diversity of this ecosystem, just like the diversity of an ecosystem in Yellowstone National Park, is going to be important for the overall health of the organism. And they might not know exactly why this diversity makes you a lot more healthy, but in nature, we know that there's a great deal of resiliency when it comes to having this diversity. So the overriding message for cultivating a healthy microbiome is to have a diverse microbiome. And that's essentially what we're going to be discussing tonight, because that is the overriding message. As I said, if you have a diverse microbiome, meaning you have lots of different species, then you're going to have a healthy microbiome that's going to be able to interact with the rest of your body in various different ways. As I said, it acts like an internal organ, because if it disappears, the effects are dramatic, actually. And they may not be as dramatic as if you removed a liver or something of that sort, some other organ, but the long distance relationship between the gut and the brain and all across the entire body is really incredible. And we'll actually be talking a bit about that as we go through. And it weighs 2 to 5 pounds. So we're talking about the skin microbiome, we're talking about the gut microbiome. There's various different types of skin microbiome, different microbiome on your face, of skin there, under your arms, chest, breasts. They all have a specific type of microbiome. In other words, a specific diversity. And we'll get into all that, but let's get more into some of the practical things, because that's really what is important. So let's talk a little bit about what disrupts a healthy microbiome. We know that there are various cultures around the world that have a much healthier microbiome, much more diverse. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But when you understand what the disruptors are, what actually is going to negatively influence your microbiome, you start to understand why in the modern industrialized world, we have a lot of chips stacked against us. So here are some of the disruptors. We have medications, we have environmental issues, synthetic sweeteners, antibiotics, various types of extreme diets, like example, going on a super low carb diet all of a sudden. And the reason why that would affect your microbiome is because when you're on a very, very low carb, super low carb diet, all of a sudden, a lot of the plant fibers that serve as food for the microbiome have essentially gone away. And the ecosystem, thinking of it from that analogy, is going to suffer because certain species are going to lose their food and they're going to go away. and your diversity is going to decrease. Stress and aging, and there are studies that basically are showing that by updating and sort of renewing or making youthful the microbiome, that you can actually reverse some of the signs of aging. There's so many amazing, remarkable things about the science that's coming out in terms of manipulation. We'll get into that a little bit further when we talk about the revolution that's happening with the microbiome. So let's go through some of these. Stomach acid blocking drugs like Prilosec, anti-inflammatory, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen and naproxen, statins. And statins are interesting because they change the way the microbiome looks to what you would see with someone who has metabolic syndrome, where they have elevated blood sugar and elevated triglycerides, increased obesity. And this has been said many times by many lecturers. I couldn't actually find the actual scientific study or report that showed that, so it needs a reference. But I've heard from many experts that basically say that statins, unfortunately, basically change the microbiome to look like someone who is obese, type 2 diabetic, that sort of thing. So all of these things are going to interfere. Now, some of us need to be on some of these medications, and that's just the way it is. And some of these medicines also interfere with certain types of nutrients, like micronutrients, which we spoke about last week, like statins, for example, decrease something called coenzyme Q10. That's why it's very important for people who are on statin to take coenzyme Q10 supplement. So all of these are going to interfere with it. Of course, as I said, for some of us, we need to be on these medications. Obviously, there are lots of lifestyle modifications and changes to be able to get you off of a lot of these medications. And that's something that you can discuss with someone who has an interest in lifestyle medicine to be able to figure out a way to get off of some of these medications. Now, just because you have some of these disruptors doesn't mean that you can't have a healthy microbiome. It just means that it might be a little bit more difficult and potentially something that, might be something to work towards trying to get rid of. Environmental glyphosate is going to interfere with your gut microbiome. Synthetic sweeteners like aspartame, sucralose, saccharin, all of these are going to, unfortunately, have been shown to kill certain species in your microbiome. So this could be backfiring in a lot of ways. So if you're having a Diet Coke or a Diet Pepsi with one of these ingredients in it, and it's skewing your microbiome to favor a microbiome that might be similar to someone who has excess weight or is obese, then it's sort of backfiring. We also know that there are various unusual situations where people who are on these sweeteners have, unfortunately, elevated blood sugar, even though they're often using these to avoid increased blood sugar. So that's a problem. Now, I always say when synthetic sweeteners come up that it's sort of boring for me to talk about how it affects the microbiome, but let's talk a little bit about what it does to your appreciation of natural foods. You see, your taste sensation is like a thermostat, meaning it sort of gets kicked on when you have something sweet. If you've never seen an artificial sweetener that's excessively sweet, that is not found in natural foods, then the set point of that thermostat to sort of kick on gets elevated, which basically means that if you're eating a lot of synthetic sweeteners, then your appreciation for natural fruits like blueberries and things that are not overpoweringly sweet, it could be less, which could be part of the reason, and definitely is part of the reason, why when people are on these types of sweeteners and I'm doing sort of a lifestyle modification, it's very important for me to describe this to them so that they can realize that this sort of abnormally set kick thermostat will reset itself after a couple weeks, which means that eventually and amazingly, what was just like, blueberries are, they're good, but that can turn into, wow, this is incredibly delicious because they're able to perceive the sweetness that they actually couldn't perceive before. Really incredible. Antibiotics, of course, that makes sense because antibiotics kill microbes. So if you're on antibiotics, then you are basically, killing off different bacterial species. Now, sometimes you need to be on an antibiotic. And generally speaking, your microbiome does rebound, but it can take a long time. And it sometimes doesn't come back with the exact amount of diversity that we've been speaking about as it did before. But again, if you have an infection, obviously you need to be on an antibiotic. We've spoken about going super low carb, stress and aging, and stress is an interesting one because not only does it affect the microbiome, but it also affects the border of the gut. So the membrane of your gut can actually become more open when you're under a lot of stress, or even when you overexercise, you can actually get increased what they call gut permeability, which can affect lots of different things. It can affect allergies, it can affect a whole host of things, and we've spoken about that before. But stress has an enormous impact. And I've spoken about the 4 pillars of health and how you always need to look at things from 4 different perspectives. So there's mental state, so that partly is stress. Mental stress, as an example, is going to affect this as well. And then there's the nutritional. Number 2 is nutritional. 3 is environmental influences, we've spoken about. And then 4 is movement, mechanics, exercise. And we've spoken a little bit about that. So it's a good idea to sort of filter all kinds of new information into these 4 pillars of health because they sort of encompass everything about thinking about overall health. Now, we all know that fermented foods, which are essentially foods that are allowing your bacteria, allowing the bacteria in the foods to grow. And we know that that is associated with a better gut microbiome. Now, there are all kinds of fermented foods, and we'll talk a little bit about all those different types of fermented foods. But keep in mind that most cultures around the world have some sort of fermented food. We have, obviously, in South Korea, there's kimchi, and in Germany, there's sauerkraut. In Japan, there's a whole host of things like natto, which we'll talk about, as well as other types of fermented foods. And what's really miraculous about fermented foods and of course, in times past, it was used to preserve food from spoiling. But the fact is that I think it's really miraculous because take a cabbage. Cabbage naturally has the bacteria on it that fermented. It already has this lactic acid residing bacteria on residing naturally on the cabbage, waiting almost in some kind of miraculous way to be able to ferment this cabbage. So it's almost, again, to me, it feels miraculous that this is already loaded into the system to be able to assist us to, 1, preserve our food, and 2, increase our health. And the fact that it's there, and the fact that when fermentation starts, it produces a host of chemicals that we haven't even begun to understand, probably tens of thousands of chemicals that we haven't even identified yet. To me, that is miraculous. And last week, as you know, we spoke about micronutrients and how essentially there's like less than 200 that have really been described in detail. And there are literally tens of thousands of plant chemicals that probably have beneficial effects. So we live in a miraculous world where there is an enormous amount of complexity, an enormous amount of beneficial compounds that we have yet to identify. And so going back to nature and having this genuine appreciation of nature as this incredibly remarkable, miraculous, thing that we're surrounded by. And to me, it's amazing. It reminds me of, there's that quote by Albert Einstein. He said, there are basically 2 ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle, and one is as though everything is a miracle. And I think when you start to understand the great complexity and the great benefit that is naturally built into to these processes that occur naturally and that natural cultures have traditional cultures have used for ages and thousands of years, it just seems to me that this is incredibly miraculous. And so that's how I see it. So let's talk a little bit about fermented foods and a little bit about home versus store-bought. Now, if you've been on my episodes, we've certainly spoken about making your own home ferments, doing kimchi or sauerkraut is probably the easiest one. And I made a video on my YouTube channel that you can go there and learn how to do it. But obviously I always recommend this book here, this book, The Art of Fermentation by Sandra Katz, that you get a really good understanding of all the fermentation strategies around the world, including what I just opened up to, which is fermenting meat, fish, and eggs, which perhaps sounds disgusting to ferment meat. And in fact, I don't want to get too off track, but as many of you know, I've because of Miracle Noodle, I've traveled to Japan many times, and I was out to dinner once with some people that I was going to do business with, and I don't eat shellfish, so they took me to a seafood place, and they felt bad that I don't eat shellfish, and so they ordered this thing called funazushi, which is basically fermented fish, which has basically been fermented for a very long time, like on the order of months, and it's probably one of the most disgusting things. I actually ate it and surprisingly didn't think it was too bad, but the smell was terrible. Now I'm not going to suggest you do anything of the sort. Fermenting a piece of fish is a very traditional thing, and actually in Japan, not many people like that particular food. Anyway, don't want to get too far off. We're talking about things that we all know about: sauerkraut, yogurt, kefir, those sorts of things. So let's talk a little bit about home versus store-bought. Let me do a time check. Wow, time is going fast. So when they ferment the let's say yogurt at the store, they're only fermenting to get to a yogurt taste and a yogurt texture, which basically means that you're not necessarily getting the amount of bacteria that you want. So doing home ferments allows you to actually increase the number of bacteria, which is sort of like the analogy that Dr. William Davis makes. Is it reminds him of that question you ask kids. Would you rather have $1 million or 1 penny that doubles every day for 30 days, which yields something like $5 million, just doubling 1 penny to 4, 8, 16. But when you get to the last 5 days of the month, you go above like $5 million. So the same thing happens here, that if you're just doing, say, a 4-hour yogurt ferment that happens at most yogurt companies, essentially you're not getting that much bacterial growth. So one of the ways to do that is to do your own home ferments that allows you to lengthen the fermentation. So you can take yogurt you can buy a yogurt maker as an example, and you can take yogurt, a little bit of yogurt, put that in, and then do an overnight ferment. So that, add milk. And these yogurt makers are very, very inexpensive. You can get them for like $40. You put a little bit of yogurt in there, a little bit of kefir, which is even better because there's a lot more bacterial diversity. And you allow that to ferment for a lot longer period of time. The same thing goes with sauerkraut. I usually, when I make my own sauerkraut, I let it ferment for 3 days, but sometimes I let it go a little bit longer. In Germany, they kept these throughout the entire winter as to be able to have vegetables. And obviously the texture, the flavor, and all these sorts of things are great to experiment with. And one of the questions I often get is, can you really get sick from doing these ferments? It's very rare for that to happen. And when it does go off, it smells really bad. And it's very, very rare for that to happen. I've had a few times where I've done some yogurt ferments because I was doing something very experimental, and I think some yeast got in there. It smelled a little yeasty. I've never made a sauerkraut that's gone bad. And so I would highly recommend, obviously YouTube is filled with videos, not just mine, on how to do fermentation, but I recommend Sandra Katz's book because it really gives you a general understanding of fermentation and its role in history and in human health. So how do you hack these? As I've said, um, the other thing is obviously extending fermentation times, adding a prebiotic fiber. So something like inulin, you can add to the yogurt, and that will give a little bit of food to the bacteria so that you can actually increase the amount of bacteria. I see we have a question coming in. Sheila's asking, does getting a flu shot, especially a higher dose one, disrupt one's microbiome in any negative way? No, I'd probably not. I mean, if you get, obviously some people can get sick from a flu shot, so maybe, but no, I don't think it affects the microbiome. Also, when you're hacking these home ferments, you are also going to get, especially if you're adding, say, a prebiotic fiber, you're getting high amounts of butyrate. As I mentioned a minute ago about this sort of incredible, miraculous diversity of chemicals that's produced, one of them is something called butyrate. And butyrate, it helps blood pressure, feeds the gut lining, helps blood sugar as well as blood pressure. Has a whole host of things, deeper sleep as well. Butyrate is just one of these things that sometimes people call a postbiotic. It's something that's created afterwards. And we're finding out incredibly that it's these probably tens of thousands of chemicals that are produced that you're never going to get by taking, a probiotic as an example, but you're going to get them when you do your own ferments with vegetables. And there's so many things you can ferment. It's amazing. I've done lots of experiments at home. One of the ones I did recently that I'm probably going to make a video on is something called water kefir. You can make your own soda, and it's very, very, very low in sugar because the fermentation is used to create that. It's naturally bubbly and carbonated from the fermentation, and you can make like a ginger ale. I made a grape soda. It's a really nice way of having like a soda that is probiotic, because it's you can see it gets cloudy, because if you buy sauerkraut, you want to make sure that it's a little bit cloudy. If it's not refrigerated, then it's probably just vinegar and water with vegetables. You want to have something that is naturally fermented. And some people will actually if they buy it at the store, it's so cheap to make your own sauerkraut. But sometimes we don't want to do that. It's just sauerkraut at the store can be very, very costly. Nonetheless, you can actually leave it out for a little while and increase the amount of bacterial counts. Just make sure that you periodically open the jar, because it can build up a little bit of pressure. But I highly recommend buying a yogurt maker and trying to make your own kefir from a store-bought kefir. And that's really a way of getting an enormous amount of extra bacteria, which is always going to increase the benefit of the fermented foods. So we've spoken a little bit about these metabolic byproducts and quote postbiotics. And like I said, this is just a whole world of chemicals that have yet to be studied. And some of them actually look like neurotransmitters. And that's another reason why we're finding out, again, in a miraculous way, that this microbiome that you have can affect your brain, can affect your stress level, can affect distant parts of the body. Because as I said, some of these look like neurotransmitters. And some of them, as an example, which I've used before, is that a lot of people think that pomegranates have an incredible benefit on human health, in the sense that they're actually able to open up your carotid arteries in such a way that if you had a medicine that was as effective, it would probably be a $1 trillion medicine. And what most scientists believe is that the reason that this is happening is not because of the polyphenols and the pigments that are in the pomegranate, but it's what is done to those by bacteria in your gut. In other words, the pigments are going into your beneficial bacteria, and then they're producing another chemical in response. which basically means that, again, there's a whole world of chemicals that we are just going to discover that have all kinds of medicinal properties that probably will be turned into medications at some point. But if you can get them in the best ways by actually making sure you have the best diversity of your gut, which is what we're talking about, which raises the point of, well, what if your gut bacteria is not good, is not healthy, and you do pomegranate? The implication is that if it's not healthy, it's not able to create that secondary product, and therefore maybe the results are not going to be as good for you. So that's another reason why it's important for you to include a good amount of fermented foods, getting rid of disruptors. And now we'll talk a little bit about how to increase the biodiversity of your microbiome. Again, if you have any questions, just like Sheila, just please do put them into the box there. So let's get into, we've already talked about a fair amount of practical tips, and we're going to get into some more now. And we're going to go through various different categories. So prebiotic fiber. Now, prebiotic fiber is essentially fiber that feeds the microbiome, that feeds the bacteria in your gut. It's like food for your bacteria. And if you get various different kinds of fibers, then essentially you're going to be able to provide an enormous variety of food that's going to increase the diversity of the gut microbiome. There are all kinds of different prebiotic fibers, and each meal should have some prebiotic fiber in it. Mushrooms are a great source, beans, onions, garlic. A lot of people ask about lectins and beans. Lectin is something that can irritate the gut for some people, especially if you have, say, autoimmune disease or other gut issues. And in that case, you want to make sure that the beans are pressure cooked or prepared traditionally. There's lots of ways of soaking and rinsing beans, but pressure cooked beans and beans from a company called Eden Foods are already pressure cooked, and it makes them more digestible even for people who don't have a lectin issue. I happen to buy Eden beans, or I also have a pressure cooker, and it definitely makes them more digestible. But honestly, you don't need all that many beans to be able to have enough prebiotic fiber. We're talking just, maybe 2 or 3 tablespoons of beans would be enough to get the amount of fiber that you would need to be just to, keep feeding the gut bacteria. Obviously, there are all kinds of additional fibers like inulin, acacia, green banana flour, konjac flour. That's why miracle noodle is so great, because you can have a little bit of miracle noodle, and that's which is made of konjac flour. So it's a very potent prebiotic fiber, and that's one way of getting a little bit of noodles and rice and pasta and still actually able to get some prebiotic fiber. It's one of the reasons of many, one reason among many that I was really just blown away by the potential of miracle noodle when I first saw it in Japan. Now, keep in mind that we've been speaking about diversity through this entire talk, which means that if you were to just do inulin all the time, 3 times a day, you're only giving your microbiome one food. So you don't want to go crazy with one supplement of fiber. You want to mix it up. And that's why, different kinds of plants, vegetables, obviously these things that have fiber in them are going to be beneficial. As natural as you can get it is going to be great. But if you want to buy a little inulin, people dissolve a little bit of that, a teaspoon or a tablespoon in coffee, it disappears, virtually disappears, and can be add a little sweetness to whatever you put it in. It disappears very, very easily. We've spoken a lot about eating different classes of plants. As we've spoken about before, just in review, a lot of people eat broccoli, and then they eat kale, and then they eat cauliflower, as an example. Those are all in the same family of cruciferous vegetables. And what we've been able to determine, and we've spoken about before, is that you want to eat from different classes, different families. So while kale and broccoli have have somewhat different features, they're still in the same family, and they're more alike than they would be different from, let's say, what would be in, say, another family of plants, like the daisy family, where there's some lettuces. It's a totally different set of characteristics. So you want to eat across different families of vegetables. And honestly, the more we talk every week, the more you can really start to see that your choice of vegetables is really, and your choice of maintaining diversity, and your choice of finding which vegetables, which plants essentially are good for you and you digest well, is really the key to unlocking, sort of that next level of health. I put here the Hadza people in Tanzania because they're known to have one of the healthiest microbiome. And one of the things that they eat is 600 species of plants. And how many do you think Westerners have? You can type that into the chat box. How many types of plants do you think that Westerners on average eat? Type that in and we'll see how close you get. Now there's Linda's saying, hi Linda. Linda's saying 12. Anyone else? Karen, 20. Yeah, so it's less than 50. Less than 50. Sharon's saying 25. Yeah, so it's a small amount. And when we realize that the healthiest microbiome is, and probably traditional, well, we know traditional old-time cultures, they were eating an enormous number of different species of plants. And we're so blessed to be able to go to, your local store and be able to try all kinds of different vegetables. And I urge you to do that, because we get into this habit of going to the store. I know all of you, I bet 95% of you always go and you get your broccoli and you get your romaine lettuce. And like, that's your sort of every day, every week type of trip to the store. And I'd like to urge you, and probably, I think I probably urge you almost every week to start trying different types of plants. Buy the chard, buy, different varieties of kale, or buy, try, instead of, onions, buy leeks, and just increase the diversity. That's the best thing you can do for yourself. And it makes things exciting. It makes your food, makes you experiment with food. It makes you appreciate food a little bit better. And so I probably overemphasize that every week. I probably say it every week. So next is, they did a study where they actually compared high plant intake against adding fermented foods. So the results of this study actually showed that the fermented foods had a higher impact on reducing inflammation and biodiversity. So both groups did very, very well. So this really points to the fact that you want to have some fermented foods every day. It needs to be included in your diet. And given the diversity of fermented foods that are available and the ease at which you can do this at home, there's no reason not to. A lot of people then, I certainly have people ask, some people can't have a lot of salt, and fermented foods don't have that much salt. I mean, fermented foods do have salt, and therefore some people can't have them. So that can be an issue. There is a fermented food that doesn't have salt, and you can certainly make. I've seen people make sauerkraut with celery juice instead of salt, because celery naturally has sodium in it. Therefore, it's a low salt ferment. Sandra Katz talks a little bit about how to sort of lower the salt. You have to be a little bit more careful with your fermentation when you use a lower salt content. There's something called natto, which is a Japanese fermented soybean, which is a wonder, like a superfood times 10, because it has it doesn't have any salt in it, but it also has an enormous amount of vitamin K2, which we spoke about last week. And but unfortunately, I happen to like it, but unfortunately it's slimy and it has a little bit of an unusual smell. But I highly recommend people try it. There's a company called NYTURE, Niture, Natto, New York Natto. And I buy that and they mail it to you. And I recommend, especially for everyone, but especially for women, because there's been some studies to show that there are some of the low rates of cancer in Japanese women could be related to natto consumption. So I highly recommend it. Just trying it, you can buy it from that company, and give it a try and see how you like it. It's nutty. Again, I happen to like it, but unfortunately, there are some people don't like the it's, as I said, it's a little bit slimy. Another thing is to get out in nature and get a dog or a pet. Go to a dog park, or when you interact with dogs, it's been shown to increase the biodiversity of your gut. Also, getting out in nature as well. As we spoke about in the very beginning, your body is like an ecosystem, and we know now that becoming overly sterilized is a problem. It increases allergies in kids, and it's not something that is overall good for your health. We evolved in nature, and nature has a lot of microbes, and we're able to have a balanced ecosystem happen. And now with COVID, we're all sterilizing everything, and one could say, and the authors of this book, The Good Gut, Justin and Erica Sonnenberg, have spoken about how now we're sterilizing everything. So getting fermented foods is a way of naturally introducing beneficial bacteria to yourself in the healthiest way possible, that we might not be getting from the environment, because we're all adding, putting alcohol on our hands and that sort of thing. So adding fermented foods could be sort of an antidote to this sort of over sterilization that we're dealing with now. It's important to note, just for your general understanding, let me just do a time check, that the baby's microbiome has lasting impacts on their overall health. Doesn't mean that they're destined to have poor health if they're born with a poor microbiome. That I don't mean to say that, but there have been some studies to show that babies that are born by C-section, because they're not going through, not having a vaginal birth and picking up bacteria there that seed the gut, that there are some increases in certain inflammatory conditions. Breast milk is the best thing for babies, as we know. It's loaded with both probiotics and prebiotics. There's a certain type of oligosaccharide that's in the breast milk, and so very important. Obviously, a vaginal birth with a breastfed infant is going to honor nature, and obviously, it's not surprising that it reflects very much in the microbiome of the baby being much more diverse. So just something for your general health. So we've gotten through the majority of tonight's episode, and we haven't even really spoken about probiotics. And the question is how important are taking probiotics? And generally, the answer is not that important. I refer back to last week and earlier in tonight's episode, where I spoke about this enormous complexity of not just the micronutrients that we spoke about last week, but we spoke about the incredible diversity of these tens of thousands of metabolites, these chemicals formed after the bacteria. But on top of that, we have trillions of bacteria, and we have probably, I don't know how many thousands and thousands of different subtypes of bacteria. And so how can we really know with any sort of certainty, just by throwing certain lactobacillus or bifidobacteria supplements into your gut, that's going to have any sort of impact? Well, the only way we're going to know is if somehow studies are done to be able to determine that. And there have been some, and so therefore, for specific conditions, there are certain probiotics that have been shown to be beneficial. Generally, though, if you're healthy, there's really no need for you to be taking a probiotic. And in fact, I think it could potentially be harmful, because how can you possibly know, as I said, how can you possibly know in any way how to manipulate the gut microbiome when you're dealing with tens of thousands of variations, and you're just throwing in, a bunch of ones that, some company thinks are beneficial. Nonetheless, if you do have a specific condition, there's a website called usprobioticguide.com. And on this website, you can look up a specific condition. And in that condition, you can basically see if there are any decent studies to show that a certain probiotic strain is going to be beneficial for that condition. So, so the answer is for someone who's healthy, who just wants to have a good microbiome, there's absolutely no need for you to take a probiotic, and I actually recommend against it. For a specific condition, check out this website and put in the condition and see if there are any strains that could potentially be helpful. Some very interesting things happening with skin disease and the skin microbiome, and just something to pay attention to as the science comes out. So we're coming down to the end of the hour, but I'd like to talk a little bit about what's happening next. And this is really, if you haven't sort of ascertained that I believe that, and most people do, that there is a revolution in medicine that's happening, then really, hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll have you'll realize that something amazing is happening here, and we're just at the very beginning of this. We've gone through all kinds of stages in medicine where it's sort of paradigm changing types of things, where we had the era of antibiotics, and that era of antibiotics was a revolution, and we sort of, doctors felt like they had more control over things than they ever had in the past. We had the era of genetics, and we're really realizing that the genetic promise never really turned out to be all that much, because there's so many factors that influence the genetic expression. But what's happening with microbiome medicine is we're sort of entering a new phase of sorts, and there's so much to learn. I mentioned fecal transplants because what they've been able to do is show, as an example, for people who, twin studies where, one is a little bit overweight and the other is not, by transplanting some fecal matter from one to the other, you can actually get changes in people's weights. Certainly fecal transplants have been shown to improve things like C. difficile colitis, which is something that can happen after being on antibiotics. And, the cure rate for that was like, 30 or 40%. With treating it with the antibiotic. Now with a fecal transplant, as gross as that may sound, you can basically get like over 90% cure of that particular condition. Next, what's happening is machine learning and computational biology. Essentially, this has all been done in Israel. There's been some amazing, incredible work done in Israel. And this was done in the Weizmann Institute, where they basically looked at blood sugar response and combined that with the gut microbiome. So they can tell you what your blood sugar response is going to be based on looking at your microbiome. So it could be that that one person eats ice cream and their blood sugar spikes, and someone eats ice cream and their blood sugar, nothing happens to it. And they can do that by doing what's called computational biology and machine learning, where they associate a rise in blood sugar with a particular look at what the microbiome looks like. Next, the next revolution in medicine, and it certainly pertains to the microbiome, is precision, or what's called precision medicine or personalized medicine. And a lot of times you read lots of different reports online about how this supplement, one day they say a supplement's good for you, the next day they say it doesn't do anything. And the truth of the matter is that when you look at it on an individual level, there are lots of different things that can impact whether an individual is going to be going to respond to a certain type of supplement. And we can determine that through a whole host of ways. But if you look at it on a population-based perspective, maybe the results are not going to show a huge significant effect. But that doesn't negate the fact that for certain individuals, especially if they have certain genetic susceptibilities, that certain supplements can be very helpful. As an example, there's something called the FUT2 gene, And these people have increased susceptibility to certain infections. And by increasing their microbial diversity, you can actually help not only with reducing their risk for infections, but you can also increase their B12 level, because this affects the ability for them to absorb B12. And it also increases something called GABA, which is basically like a neurotransmitter that can be very calming. So what's going to happen is you're going to eventually get your gut microbiome sequenced, and there'll be a whole host of customized interventions to be able to affect that. So this move towards personalized, or what some people call precision medicine, is really what the future is actually going to hold. And it's already starting to happen, especially with things like nutrigenomics. There's several people here who have done some nutrigenomic evaluations. And Linda, I promise to get to yours this weekend, I promise. She's been waiting for me to review her results. So I promise to get that to you this weekend. Sorry for the delay. Okay, and the next concept and basically that's the one we're going to end with, because amazingly we've come up to the end of the hour, is related to what we spoke about with the Hadza tribe in Tanzania. And when you look at these traditional populations, what we're finding is that a lot of them have bacterial species that have somehow just completely disappeared in the industrialized world. Now, these are microbes that basically traveled around the world and are resident microbes in people who are still living traditional lives, eating traditional foods, living traditional ways. So it's been hypothesized that essentially we're missing out on a great deal of diversity because of sort of the way we're essentially living. And so the concept that was raised by these authors, the Sonnenbergs, is that there's this potential for what they call rewilding the gut, by somehow restoring the traditional populations of microbes. And the theory is, of course, that that's going to improve our health, because there's a reason that for thousands and thousands of years that these certain species of microbes that exist in the gut of these traditional populations, there's certainly a reason for it. And if we can rewild it and introduce these, then we could potentially create all kinds of improvements in your overall health. And that's again, another exciting development that's going to proceed as things go along. So we covered a great deal of information here. And if anyone has any questions, please do let me know. But I'd like to just overall review what we've spoken about, because this is pretty much everything you need to know about having a healthy microbiome. Overall, right, we are basically in a situation, right, where we want to have, sorry, hold on one second. We want to have the most diverse gut, right? We want to have the most bacterial diversity. So we're going to make sure that we get fiber in every meal. We're going to make sure that we have enough fermented foods. All of you are going to, hopefully I've inspired you to be able to add some sort of fermented food into your diet every single day, especially people who have been on, antibiotics periodically from time to time, whether it's from an ear infection or anything of that sort. Then it's important for you to incorporate this. And it adds so much delight, and it's tasty to have these sorts of fermented foods, and there's so many. So get the Art of Fermentation by Sandra Katz and really start to realize that there's so much that you can add to your diet. And what more can I say? I think we've gone through some practical tips and guidelines. We've spoken about the probiotics and the things that are disruptors. So for sure, if you're using artificial sweeteners and drinking diet soda that has aspartame or saccharin or sucralose, that's something that you should just get rid of. And we went over why there are multiple reasons for that. So next week, thank you so much for your attention. I hope I answered all your questions. I think that it's a very important topic, and we'll probably bring it up again as time goes by. Next week, we're going to be talking about energy and and essentially the energy of your body is one of the factors is related to something called the mitochondria in the cell. And, again, I've spoken about how miraculous things are, but you'll see that the features, you're going to see things always repeating themselves, such that what is beneficial for one type of thing is beneficial for another. And you'll see that next week when it comes to understanding how your energy production is, how to get more energy out of life, and how to do that by optimizing something called the mitochondria. And we'll also include incredibly practical tips for you so that, again, you can take control of your health and become your own authority in health, which is really what this is all about. So thank you so much for your attention for the hour. And you can always reach out to me if you have any questions on my Facebook page. And this will the recording will be on my YouTube channel. It is there now, actually. And what can I say? Thank you so much for your attention and look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great night and a great weekend. Bye-bye.